The Darling by Anton Chekhov. Olga, the daughter of the retired middle-aged civil servant Plemyanikov, was sitting on the steps of her house leading to the yard, lost in thought. It was a hot day. The flies were making an awful nuisance of themselves, and it was pleasant to think that the evening was not far off. Dark rain clouds were gathering in the east, and from time to time there came a breath of moisture in the air from that direction. Kukin, manager and proprietor of the amusement park Tivoli, who lived in the wing of the house, was standing in the middle of it and looking again at the sky. "Again!" he cried in despair. "It's going to rain again! Every day it rains, every day, as though on purpose. It's the end, it's the ruin, terrible losses, every day." He threw up his hands in despair, and turning to Olga, he went on. "That's what my life is like, dear Olga. Enough to make you weep. You work, you do your best, you wear yourself out, you lie awake at night, always thinking how to improve things, and what happens? On the one hand, the public, ignorant savages. I give them the best musical comedies, dramatized fairy stories, first-class comics, but do you think they want it? Do they appreciate it? All they want is sideshows. All they ask for is vulgarity. On the other hand, look at the weather. Almost every day it rains. It started coming down in buckets on the 10th of May, and it rained the whole of May and June. It's simply awful. No business, but I have to pay the rent just the same, haven't I? Paying the actors, aren't I?" The next evening, clouds gathered again, and Kukin cried, laughing hysterically, "Well, what do I care? Let it rain, let it flood the park, damn me, damn my luck in this world and the next. Let the actors sue me, I don't mind going to court, I don't mind going to prison, to Siberia, to the scaffold, ha ha!" The next day, the same thing. Olga listened to Kukin in silence. She looked serious, and sometimes tears started in her eyes. In the end, Kukin's misfortunes touched her, and she fell in love with him. He was small and thin, with a yellow face, his curly hair combed back at the temples. He spoke in a thin falsetto, and when he talked, his mouth became twisted. His face always wore an expression of profound despair, and yet he aroused a deep and genuine feeling in her. She was always in love with someone, and could not live without it. When she was a young girl, she had loved her father, who now sat in a darkened room in an invalid chair, gasping for breath. She had loved her auntie, who sometimes used to come to visit them twice a year from Bryansk. Earlier still, as a schoolgirl, she had been in love with her French master. She was a quiet, good-natured, compassionate girl, with gentle, soft eyes and excellent health. Looking at her full, rosy cheeks, her soft white neck with a dark mole on it, her kind, naive smile which came into her face when she listened to anything pleasant, men thought, "Yes, you'll do," and also smiled, while women visitors couldn't restrain themselves from catching hold of her hand suddenly in the middle of a conversation and declaring in a transport of delight, "Oh, you darling!" The house in which she lived since she was born, and which was left to her in her father's will, was on the outskirts of the town in Gypsy Lane, not far from Tivoli. In the evenings, at night, she could hear the band playing in the park, the hissing and banging of fireworks. She could not help thinking that it was Kukin fighting with his fate and taking his chief enemy, the public, by storm. Her heart thrilled at the thought. She did not feel like sleeping at all, and when he came back home early in the morning, she tapped softly at her bedroom window, showing him only her face and one shoulder through the curtains, and smiled tenderly at him. He proposed to her, and they were married. And when he had a good look at her neck and her robust, plump shoulders, he threw up his hands and said, "Oh, you darling!" He was happy, but it was as it never stopped raining on his wedding day, and on his wedding night the expression of despair never left his face. They lived well after their wedding. She sat in the box office, saw that everything in the park was in excellent order, kept an account of the expenses, and paid the wages. Her rosy cheeks and her charming, naive, radiant smile could be seen now at the box office window, now behind the scenes, now in the refreshment bar, and already she was telling her friends that the theatre was the most remarkable, the most important, and the most necessary thing in the world, and that it was the only in the theatre that one could obtain true enjoyment and become truly educated and humane. But, she added, do you think the public realize this? All they want is a sideshow. Yesterday we gave Faust Inside Out, and almost all the boxes were empty. But if Vanya and I had put some vulgar rubbish, then I assure you the theatre would have been packed. Tomorrow Vanya and I are putting on Orpheus in Hell. Do come. Whatever Kukin said about the theatre and the actors, she repeated. Like him, she despised the public for their ignorance and indifference to art, interfered at rehearsals, corrected the actors, looked after the good behavior of the musicians, and when a bad notice appeared in the local paper, she cried and then went to the editorial office to demand an explanation. The actors were fond of her, nicknamed her Vanya and I, and Darling. She was sorry for them, lent them small sums of money, and if they happened to deceive her, she didn't complain to her husband, but only shed a few tears in secret. In winter, too, they lived well. They rented the theatre in town for the winter season and let it for short periods to a Ukrainian company, to a conjurer, or to local amateurs. Olga was growing stouter and always beaming with pleasure, while Kukin was growing thinner and yellower, and complained of their terrible losses, although they had not done at all badly in the winter. He coughed at night, and she made him drink hot raspberry tea and lime flower water, rubbed him with eau de cologne, and wrapped him in her soft shawls. "Oh, my sweet," she used to say with complete sincerity, stroking his hair. "Oh, my handsome one." During Lent, he left for Moscow to engage actors, and she could not sleep without him. She sat at the window and gazed at the stars. All that time she compared herself to the hens, who also cannot sleep at night, and feel uneasy when the cock is not in the hen-house. Kukin had to stay longer in Moscow. He wrote that he would be back at Easter and was already giving instructions in his letters about Tivoli. But late at night on Sunday before Easter, there was an obvious knocking at the gate. Somebody was hammering on the gate as though on a barrel. Boom! 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 The sleepy cook ran up to the gate, splashing through the puddles with her bare feet. "Open up, please," someone was saying in a hollow voice. "There's a telegram for you." Olga was used to getting telegrams from her husband, but this time, for some reason, she was paralyzed with fear. With shaking hands, she opened the telegram and read as follows. "Kukin died suddenly today. Meekly awaiting instructions to stop Gunneral Tuesday." That was how it was actually written in the telegram. Gunneral, and some incomprehensible word, meekly. It was signed by the producer of the operetta company. "Oh, my darling," Olga sobbed. "My sweet little Vanya, my darling, why did I ever meet you? Why did I know you and love you? Why? Who have you left your poor unhappy Olga to?" Kukin was buried in Moscow on Tuesday. Olga returned home on Wednesday, and as soon as she got into her bedroom, she flung herself on her bed and sobbed so loudly that it could be heard in the street and in the neighboring yards. "The darling," neighbors said, crossing themselves. "Poor darling, how does she take on?" 3 months later, Olga was returning home from Mass, heartbroken and in deep mourning. It so happened that one of her neighbors, Vasily Andreevich Pustovalov, who was also returning home from church, walked beside her. Pustovalov, the manager of the merchant Babakayev's timber yard, who wore a straw hat, a white waistcoat, and a gold watch chain, looked more like a landowner than a businessman. "Everything," he said gravely with a note of compassion in his voice, "happens according to the natural order of things. If any one of a dear one dies, it is because it is the will of God. In such a case, we must be brave and bear our cross without a murmur." After seeing Olga to her gate, he said goodbye and walked on. All day afterwards she could hear his grave voice, and she had only shut her eyes to see his dark beard. She liked him very much, and apparently she had made some impression on him too, for a few days later an elderly woman whom she did not know very well came to have a cup of coffee with her, and as soon as she sat down at the table she began talking about Pustovalov. According to her, he was a most excellent man, on whom one could depend, whom any girl would be glad to marry. 3 days later, Pustovalov himself paid her a visit. He didn't stay long, about 10 minutes, and didn't say much, but Olga fell in love with him so passionately that she didn't sleep a wink that night, tossing about as though in a fever, and in the morning she sent for the elderly woman. Soon they were engaged, and then came the wedding. After their marriage, Pustovalov and Olga lived happily together. He was usually at his office till dinner time, then he went out on business, and his place at the office was taken by Olga, who was there till the evening, making out accounts and seeing to the delivery of goods. "The price of timber," she would say to her acquaintances and customers, "rises 20% every year now. Why, we used to sell local timber, and now every year my Vasily has to go for timber to the Mogilyov province. And the freight," she cried, covering her cheeks with her hands in horror, "the freight!" It seemed to her that she had been in the timber business for years, and that the most important and necessary thing in life was timber. And there was something dearly familiar and touching to her in the sound of the words beam, block, board, balk, plank, slat, scantling, batten, slab. At night she was asleep, she would dream of mountains of planks and boards, long, endless strings of wagons carting timber somewhere far from town. She dreamt of a whole regiment of 6-inch beams, 28 feet high, standing on end and marching on the timber yard, beams, logs, and boards knocking against one another, with the resounding crash of dry wood falling and getting up again, piling themselves on each other. Olga cried out in her sleep, and Pustovalov said to her tenderly, "What's the matter, Olga, darling? Cross yourself, my dear." Her husband's ideas were her ideas. If he thought the room was too hot for business, or that business was slack, she thought the same. Her husband did not care for any diversions and spent holidays at home. She did the same. "Why are you always at home or at the office?" her friends asked her. "Why don't you go to the theatre, darling, or to the circus?" "Vasily and I have no time to go to the theatre," she said gravely. "We are working folk. We can't waste time on all sorts of nonsense. What's the good of theatres?" On Saturdays, Pustovalov and Olga would go to an evening service, on holy days to early mass. They walked side by side on the way back from church, an unctuous expression on their faces. There was a nice smell about both of them, and her silk dress rustled pleasantly. At home they drank tea with buns and various jams, and afterwards they ate pie. Every day at noon there was a lovely smell of beetroot soup and roast mutton or duck in the yard and in the street near the gate, and of fish on fast days, and it was impossible to walk past the gate without feeling hungry. At the office the samovar was always on the boil, and customers were treated to tea and ring-shaped rolls. Once a week, husband and wife went to the baths and returned side by side, both red in the face. "Oh, we're very happy, thank God," Olga used to say to her acquaintances. "God grant everyone such a life." When Pustovalov was away buying timber in Mogilyov province, Olga missed him very much and lay awake at night and cried. A young army veterinary surgeon called Smirnin, who had rented a cottage in the yard, sometimes came to see her in the evenings. He used to tell her of all sorts of stories and played cards with her, and this used to divert her. His stories of his private life were particularly interesting. He was married, had a son, but was separated from his wife, who had been unfaithful to him, and now he hated her and sent her 40 rubles a month for the maintenance of their son. Hearing this, Olga sighed and shook her head. She was sorry for him. "Well, God preserve you," she used to say, seeing him off to the stairs with a lighted candle. "Thank you for helping me to while away the time, and may the Lord and the Mother of God keep you in good health." And she always expressed herself with the utmost gravity and soberness in imitation of her husband. Before the veterinary surgeon disappeared downstairs behind the door, she used to say, "I think you really ought to make it up with your wife, Mr. Smirnin. You ought to forgive her, if only for the sake of your son. I suppose the poor little boy understands everything."